Hello, team, and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine War Frontline update for the 18th of May, 2023. Let's get straight to the front line, and we go to the northeast sector. That's the Kupiansk-Kreminna front line. Not a lot of activity going on there. Talked to you yesterday about how Adivka was taken, or the last couple of days. That was just a little reconnaissance group that Andrew Perpetua talked on his live stream about how there was a Ukrainian group, reconnaissance group, that moved into here, met with some resistance, and then just retreated back to their lines. And a Russian group sort of moved into that same space. And basically, it's just really negligible activity. But yeah, on a map, I guess that they would control that. It's quite a difficult area to maintain control over because the high ground to the west is controlled by the Ukrainians, and they can just pop shots down there. So I'll probably move my blue line to reflect the Mazutivka is under Russian control, but I don't think it's anything particularly important. Other than that, there's just quite a lot of activity seems to have popped up again along this whole axis, although it's the usual repelled attacks, but it's just more than there has been over the last few weeks. So we're seeing, sorry, in the wrong place there. We're seeing lots of these names pop up again. Other than Mazutivka, we've got Novoselivka, Stelmakivka, Nevska, Bilohorivka, and all up and down that front line. There's talk about how the Russians hit a bridge in Makivka, which is here. But yeah, nothing particularly important in terms of exchange of territory, and really it is yet again all about Bakhmut. Now, in Bakhmut, we have. Let's explain my lines first of all for those who are new. So, in the Bakhmut area, kind of only here, my blue lines represent actually at the moment Andrew Perpetua as a mapper. He has some contacts on the ground. It appears to know more about what's going on to the north and south than is reflected in other mappers. The red line is a pro-Russian mapper, Suryat Maps, and the yellow line is a pro-Ukrainian mapper, Deep State Maps. But Deep State doesn't seem to be updating as often, or perhaps as much as they could do, and I don't know whether they have to adhere to operational security maybe a bit more than other mappers. The blue lines, whereas elsewhere I do my lines on the attacking force and what they control, and I put the kind of blue lines just behind that as a kind of like, well, the Ukrainians are going to be somewhere behind here, and there's going to be some grey zone between the two. But essentially, it's all about where the red line is, because recently, in the last sort of 4 or 5 months, the Russians have been on the attack, right? So that's the offensive line that I've been focusing on. When we come to Bakhmut, because the Ukrainians are on the attack again here, this now switches in the area to actually where the Russians have pulled back to. So this blue line then becomes a Russian line in Bakhmut, as according to Andrew Perpetua. The red line is a Russian line, as according to Suryat Maps, and the yellow line is a Russian line, control line, as according to Deep State Maps. So just to understand what's going on there with my map, and you can compare what the different mappers are saying. So, Andrew Perpetua seems to indicate that towards Vuhledar, the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians further back here than Suryat Maps is claiming. Broadly similar around this M03 highway, the E40 highway going out towards the northwest. And then as we come further down south, again, Andrew Perpetua has the Russians push back further in Dubovo, Vasilivka, and the surrounding area, whereas the other two mappers are broadly in agreement there. I did hear some claims that the Ukrainians had put a major attack in the Vuhledar direction with a whole bunch of mechanized equipment. This is from Weeb Union, actually, but he claimed, a bit pro-Russian to be fair, claimed that the Russians had repelled that attack, and it was significant numbers of tanks, armored equipment, and infantry as well. So that's not confirmed, but there could be a larger attack going on here. And whether the Russians have properly repelled that or not, again, completely unconfirmed. That's just from what Weeb Union has said. So take that with a pinch of salt. But there could be some activity going on there, and that's kind of reflected, I suppose, in Andrew Perpetua's, Russian control is further push further back towards Solidar. But as we come down to Dubovo-Vasilivka, there's activity around there in this northern area, northwestern area. We have the situation where the Ukrainians are pushing the Russians back in the north and to the south of Bakhmut, and we're starting to get a kind of straighter line here rather than this really deep cauldron that there was, particularly in the earlier stages when the Russians were on the eastern outskirts of Bakhmut. Now they are almost fully in control of Bakhmut, apart from the last sort of couple of buildings and micro districts. This is now straightening up. We have a lot of activity near Klishchivka. Klishchivka is getting quite a lot of press, if you like, in the open source intelligence community. But still, Deep State Map hasn't adjusted the lines too much around there. In fact, Suryat Map has just updated to show that the Ukrainians have gained land here, but hasn't sort of talked about it. Often there's like blue lines to suggest that Ukrainians have made gains, but actually we haven't seen Suryat Map talk about that in the south, and I don't know whether that's because there's greater success in the south. We hadn't seen it up to now, and even now it's not as widespread as it has been. So there's a little bit of indication here, but actually it goes a little bit further than that, arguably. And that's a good 24 hours behind where you'd imagine it should have been, especially since, and I talked about this yesterday, when when the Russians make the gains in the middle of Bakhmut, Suryat Maps is right on it. It's like, this is what's happened, and then as soon as the Ukrainians push back, there's like a 24-hour, 36-hour delay. We can see here, this is what's claimed. These tiny areas that are taken, although that's hugely significant because there's hardly anything left. But Suryat Maps is right on that every day, and yet, as I say, delay there. But nonetheless, let's concentrate on the outside before we go into the interior of Bakhmut. There is this large area to the west of Klishchivka that the Russians have been pushed back from. There's been fierce fighting here. There's an awful lot of footage about that's kicking about in terms of trench warfare going on here. So if you remember, and I'll bring up the topographic map here. So this is the topographic map of Bakhmut area, and you can see that Bakhmut sits in lower ground, the river valley. As a river runs through it, we have Krasnohora just up there. We had the Ukrainians push back past, up this road, back from the river, and then adopting the higher ground back here. And likewise, although there are lots of sort of little, I guess, gullies and whatnot in the area, Chaziv Yar here sits on high ground. And importantly, Klishchivka here sits on lower ground. As you can see, this is Klishchivka here with a bluff just behind it, or not really a bluff, a hill. And on that hill, there's a network of trenches that were built some time ago. They weren't just built for this conflict now, but probably since 2014 onwards. The trench line can be seen on the 2018 footage. Now, I was talking to you yesterday about how the Ukrainians were expecting to hold on to this when the Russians were attacking for a lot longer than they did. There are some complaints, apparently, says Andrew Perpetua, that the Ukrainians are saying that the trench network wasn't very well built, and that could be a reason why they pulled out much sooner. But also, they were getting hammered by artillery. The claims are now that if Russia were to lose this area in both north and south of Bakhmut, that actually the Russians wouldn't be able to regain it as easily, because they gained this on the back of an awful lot of artillery usage. So when you're talking about Zaitsevo and Kodema and these areas here, that when the Russians took these, they just basically hammered it with massive artillery barrages and then overwhelmed it with huge troop superiority. But they don't have either of those things anymore. So if they lose this area to the Ukrainians, actually it's going to be far more difficult for the Russians to retake it at a future point. And so it also seems that the Ukraine can take these places with minimal resources, like with just existing troops from the area, rotational troops and reserve troops in Konstantinivka and Chaziv Yar. They're not putting their full counteroffensive capabilities to and the new equipment and trained troops that they have ready for that counteroffensive. They're not using them in this area. They appear to just be using existing troops. And they're able to do that because the Russians have culminated that much. Indeed, where you've got Prigozhin having a right or whinge about what is going on. So he's been complaining that the conventional Russian forces have come to support Wagner as Wagner have culminated and can't recruit in the prison service anymore, being hamstrung to some degree by the Kremlin and by the Russian MOD. But they're the ones, certainly as he sees it, who have spent all their blood, effort, energy, resources taking Bakhmut over a year. I mean, the first shell landed on Bakhmut in May 17th. So yesterday, 1 year ago. So actually, this has been a 12-month assault on Bakhmut that has not quite taken Bakhmut. And it's an absolute failure, but it's on the brink of being a scare quote success for the Russians. And now he sees the flanks as capitulating and is fully blaming that on the Russians. And then the Russians are saying in their MOD releases that their Russian troops are adopting more favorable positions. And he's taking the mickey out of that by saying adopting more favorable positions is like French for effing off and cacking themselves, as he says here. So, quote, unfortunately, the territories that the Wagner PMC for months were taking away from the enemy, including the area of Klishchivka, which have been lost as of today by units of the Ministry of Defense, are these exact more favorable positions when you give the enemy huge territories soaked with the blood of our combat comrades. When the MOD give this territory away, this is now called effed off whilst cacking themselves. I'm euphemizing that, but they call it took more favorable positions. So he's really, really angry about that situation. So if we look to the south, you can see the amount of territory that the Ukrainians appear to have captured. Ukrainian forces continue to push Russian forces back to Bakhmut's flanks, a considerable part near Klishchivka, south of Bakhmut. So if we go and look at this area of Klishchivka, you will see the trench lines that are in the hills behind. So remember, and I'm going to go back to the topographic map, this is in low ground, and behind is the high ground. So this area is high ground that the Russians appear to have pulled back to. But you've got large trench networks, as you can see here, zigzagging around this raised, elevated ground behind Klishchivka. There you get the trench networks that some of the Ukrainians were saying weren't particularly well constructed or well planned. So that could be why they gave them up quicker than we were expecting. So the Russians are now pushed back to the outskirts of Klishchivka. There are claims that there could be fighting in Klishchivka. For the last week or so, the Ukrainians have hammered, as I mentioned this morning, that Andrew Perpetua said he'd seen something like 8 or 9 bits of confirmed footage of like self-propelled howitzers, self-propelled mortars, being taken out in Klishchivka alone. So 9 pieces of artillery equipment. When we see these massive numbers of artillery, today it was like 32 pieces of artillery. And you think, well, just in this small village here, they've had at least 9 pieces verified taken, as according to Perpetua, taken out. You can see how important artillery has been in the past in the offensive of the Russians. They use it to flatten and then move in and take over. Well, Ukrainians are taking out these pieces with explicit targeting, and they have been doing that in Klishchivka, and that has now allowed them to get their troops in and move in and try and take these trenches in the high ground to the west. Klishchivka is really important actually for defending Chasiv Yar. If Ukraine are willing to concede Bakhmut to the Russians, and you think, right, okay, Russians now control Bakhmut, and it's not about encircling Bakhmut, then what they would want to do is now go on to defending Chasiv Yar. I don't think the Russians have the ability. I think they've probably culminated. They won't have the resources and the troops and the morale to take Chasiv Yar. But if that's what they were trying to do, then you would need to hold on to Klishchivka to defend Chasiv Yar, because you're holding on to this high ground, you're defending that high ground, you've got some entrenchments there, and this allows Chasiv Yar not to be flanked. And the same with some of these places to the north up here. So it's really important that Ukraine maintain a defensive line aside from what their offensive intentions might be. And that offensive line is going to, look like that. So a straight line there to defend Chasiv. So as we then go into Bakhmut itself, we can see that the last buildings of Bakhmut are just about to fall to the Russians. The lines here, remember, the deep state map in yellow and Suryat maps in red. Suryat maps has much more updated Russian control in the last remaining buildings and micro districts of Bakhmut. I was talking in the news piece this morning. I could get a little bit philosophical. Like, Bakhmut, what is Bakhmut? Bakhmut is a place. Where does Bakhmut begin and end? I mean, does it end in the very last building? Does it end on this road? It's kind of neither here nor there. Like, who cares what Bakhmut is? The importance of Bakhmut is what it does, is in its function, right? So Ukraine are wanting to hold on, have wanted to hold on and defend Bakhmut because it offers them utility. What is the function of Bakhmut? It's fixing Russian troops, and it's attriting Russian troops. So if they are pushed out these last buildings, it doesn't matter, or it matters only as much as their ability to continue that function. Now, can they continue to fix Russian troops and attrit them if the fighting then starts going into these fields here and towards Ivanivska? I don't know that that is the case, and that's probably why they're wanting to hold on as much as they can in these last remaining vestiges of Bakhmut. It's about the functional utility of Bakhmut to the Ukrainians. Right, here's a Wagner map, which shows that the Ukrainians are definitely having successes to the north and to the south here. And there could be movements even further north towards Vuhledar, but we don't know. That's unconfirmed. That would make sense to me, as they could, come down here and pincer this whole kind of Zalizniansky area and the road sort of cut down from the north and cut up from the south. The War Mapper map says that there have been no confirmed changes of control since the last update, although that's not what the other mappers are saying. No reports talking about progress in the south near Klishchivka. The day before yesterday, I reported that Russian troops have largely left the area west of Klishchivka, which has now been occupied by Ukrainian troops for the last 24 hours. A lot is happening, winky face. So he seems to be very confident things are happening there. The Suryat map says that Ukrainians continue advancing south of Ivanivska and east of the water channel and are slowly approaching Klishchivka. Again, I wouldn't say that slowly. Or if you're comparing it to what the Russians have done over the last year, I'd say it's pretty quickly. But, if you want to call that slowly, that's fine. And in the center, the Suryat map says the Russian army has surpassed Rumianetseva Street and are about to reach Vuhledar Street as the Ukrainians are slowly withdrawing towards southern positions. Also, clashes with the Ukrainian army are taking place around the new children's hospital. So there is, according to Suryat maps, the Ukrainians are struggling in this area and pulling out, but pushing back north and south of there. Yeah, so Wagner are pretty much pummeling the remaining buildings in Bakhmut, and that's fairly easy because there aren't many buildings left for the Ukrainians to hide in. And so all they need to do, you don't even need that much artillery. So they may still have ammunition, shell hunger, if you like, but they can still absolutely hammer the remaining buildings with a load of artillery because there just isn't that much left. So here we have more footage of buildings getting absolutely hammered all over the shop. You can see even in the distance behind, explosions all over the place. Just, it's going to be really difficult for the Ukrainians to hold on to the last remaining buildings. So will there be some kind of withdrawal today? There could well be. Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see what the Ukrainians do as a result of this kind of activity, because that's going to be pretty impossible to try and defend if you're just getting absolutely leathered by barrages of artillery consistently. And then, you get some kind of apocalyptic hellscape developing. But yeah, so that's what's going on in the center of Bakhmut, and it's again a game of two halves, with Ukrainians making advances north and south, and Russians just about to take the rest of Bakhmut. Right. If we go on to, that's pretty much what ISW says. There is some geolocated footage showing that Russians have made incremental advances in southwestern Bakhmut. Well, we can just have a look at this. This is them helping out some last remaining. It's quite incredible. Last remaining civilians in Bakhmut. You wouldn't think there'd be any left, but apparently there are. So, yep, that is there. So, yep, so that's right in the center. So, I don't know that that shows particularly there's been incremental advances, but there certainly have been advances. What the ISW say about Bakhmut is in their sort of preamble that's more relevant here. So, Russian and Ukrainian officials acknowledge continued limited Ukrainian counterattacks near Bakhmut yesterday. One prominent mill blogger complained that Russian forces must now react to Ukrainian actions, implying that Russian forces are losing the initiative in the Bakhmut area despite the limited nature of Ukrainian counterattacks in the area. So that's that. I think you're seeing limited counterattacks by the Ukrainians. They're going to try and succeed with limited resources. All the while, Russia don't have much to throw at the problem either. They are putting in resources. What will it mean as the Ukrainians lose the last few buildings here? Will we start seeing fighting in the fields between there and Ivanivska? Will Ivanivska become the new front line, or will the Ukrainians try and push a counterattack to retake some of those buildings or supply their defenders today in the last-ditch effort to hold on to some of those buildings? We shall see. Right, let's move on to Avdiivka and further down south. Russian forces conducted limited ground attacks in Adivka. The Ukrainian General Staff noted that Russian forces did not conduct any ground attacks near Avdiivka, but one mill blogger claimed that Russian forces conducted an unsuccessful one on the southwestern area of Avdiivka. So that's going to be around Pervomaisky and Vodyany. The Ukrainian General Staff stated that Ukrainian forces repelled multiple Russian ground attacks in Marinka. A Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces advanced 100 meters in Marinka and that Ukrainian forces control less than 1 square kilometer of the town. There has been very little information about Avdiivka. So, sorry, Marinka, I'm going to just bypass Avdiivka because not a lot of activity has happened. No territorial exchanges, nothing that I know to add to what ISW has said. In Marinka, there are claims that the Russians are making territorial gains there, but no mapper seems to reflect that. There are claims, as you've just heard, that the Ukrainians only control 1 square kilometer, or if you think about a kilometer, so that's a kilometer. So a square kilometer is going to be something like that, isn't it? So yeah, that's pretty much accurate for what they do claim. I would say yes, I'd agree with that. There or thereabouts. Depends whether you include this area up there. But yeah, the Ukrainians could be under quite a bit of pressure in Marinka. Having said that, I've shown you lots of footage of Ukrainian FPV drones taking out huge amounts of Russian mechanized equipment in Marinka explicitly. Russian and Ukrainian forces reportedly conducted limited ground attacks in Western Donetsk. It has been stated that Russian forces conducted 16 ground attacks against Ukrainian positions on unspecified areas of the Western Donetsk-Zaporizhia front line. A Russian mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces attempted to break through Russian defensive lines near Vuhledar. So that is a Russian claim that Ukrainians are active trying to break through in the Vuhledar area. I've not heard anything else about that. And seems to be an uptick in activity in that Western Donetsk area, as well as on towards Zaporizhia. Stupid map, stupid fingers. So this is the Zaporizhia area. The ISW Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank, states that Ukrainian forces reportedly continue to strike areas along critical logistics lines in southern Ukraine. Russian sources claim that yesterday Ukrainian forces shelled Tokmak, Vasilivka, and Polohy. That's going to be unsurprising. Vasilivka is down there. That's going to be possibly one of the prongs of attacks that the Ukrainians might opt for, and the others being south of Orikhiv and south of Hlopole. Polohy's there, so that's being shelled. Tokmak as well, and Vasilivka. So you can see all 3 potential regions for the attacks being softened, which could lead one to believe that they are the options that the Ukrainians might take. Then, as we come over to Kherson, there's a little bit of conversation about what's going on there. There's quite a bit of talk about the Dnipro River and whether there is or isn't going to be anything developing there. Russian forces continue to target the West Bank and islands at the Dnipro River Delta on May the 16th, 2 days ago, out of fear of planned Ukrainian counteroffensives. Kherson Oblast administration shelled Kherson Oblast 79 times between May the 16th and 17th. So it's really getting quite a hammering. A Kremlin affiliated mill blogger claimed that Russian Air Force struck Ukrainian units in Kizomys and Velentenska or on the western bank with FAB 500 aerial bombs. That's not for the first time. Mill blogger also claimed that Russian forces struck Ukrainian military equipment on Mali Potemkin Island, southwest of Kherson city, with KH-22 and caliber missiles. So it could be that they are using cruise missiles at some of these targets in the Kherson area as well. And that could be because what Russia will be wanting to do is find out areas where the air defense systems are less effective at dealing with things like cruise missiles. If you've got a bunch of cruise missiles, it's kind of like pointless sending them at cities where they've got Nazans and RST that are just taking them out routinely. And you're like, well, I'm just throwing away cruise missiles and our stocks are dwindling. They need to find places where they can get through those cracks in air defense, and it could be that they found that some of these islands have particular targets that are it's easier for their cruise missiles to hit. I've adapted my maps a little bit around here to show that actually there's more control over some of these islands for the Ukrainians than I previously understood. There's quite a bit of grey area. This island seems mainly under the control of the Ukrainians at the moment. This is Potemkin Island, I think. And then you've got this area here where the Ukrainians do have some purchase on the island. They've got across there, but whether you call that in control or not is a different matter. But they've certainly crossed. It depends whether you call these islands. These are bits of land that are separated by tiny rivulets and parts of the river delta. So whether you call that being solidly on the east bank or not, I don't know. But the Ukrainians are present there. But the terrain is quite difficult, and they've admitted that as well. In fact, I think that's at the beginning of the ISW, and this will be the last thing to say to you. Ukrainian officials reported that terrain features constrain Ukrainian offensive operations across the Dnipro River in Kherson Oblast. That is a problem for them. Yes, it's great that they might get across, but then getting across equipment and troops and moving around that area when it's so difficult to do so makes it not as useful as one might hope. But anyway, that's what's going on in Dnipro River area at the moment. And that's the frontline for you. It's mainly about Bakhmut again. Thank you for being here, for supporting this channel. Please like, subscribe, and share. I'll speak to you later in the extra video.